Hello. Welcome to my reading wrap-up and TBR for this month. My goal for 2020 was to read more books for personal reading because I haven't done a lot of personal reading in a while. And so my goal was one book a month, but I've read so far 5 books. Woo! So I am here to review them, tell you if they're good, and tell you what I'm looking forward to reading for the rest of the month. Okay, so starting off, I wrote them down in chronological order of how I read them. First book I read was Wayward Son by Rowell, which is the second of the Simon Snow books. Now apparently it's a trilogy. That follows Carry On, which was a novel, which was another piece off of her other book, Fangirl. Anyways, Rowell, I would say, is like infamous now for YA books, and when I read Carry On, I was probably 13, and I loved it. It's an enemies to lovers trope, and that was my first time reading that, and I was like, I didn't know it was a thing, and I was like, oh my gosh, the innovation, like, I never saw this coming, you know, and I really loved the world building of Carry On, and the way that it kind of felt like the final book in a series minus the series. So it just kind of cut to all the good parts. And I really thought that it was an interesting experimentation in form because it would reference things and like allude to things that had happened earlier in the series, but there wasn't an earlier series. So I thought that that gave the reader an interesting adventure because you really had to pay attention and put things together and be like, what's going on? So I was very excited to read Wayward Son. I think it's been out for like a year now, and I just couldn't do it. I was like, I don't know, like if it's gonna be good, can I handle it being good? And if it's gonna be bad, can I handle it like ruining the original novel? It's a road trip story, basically, and it's in America. It's a road trip across America, and I don't want to spoil it, but it's Simon and Baz and Penny, and they're going on a road trip to rescue Angela? Is that her name? Angela? We can really see that this book impacted my life. And Angela, I'm just gonna call her Angela, I sure hope that's her name. This one I read as an audiobook. I will also be giving a critique of the audio performance, but we'll get there. So Angela, she goes to UCSD, so they were having like some California characters being like, oh, she's plant-based, you know, that's very California. And as a Southern California person, I just felt very attacked. But I thought it was funny and it was a good comedic bit. So that was like one of my favorite parts of the book, was that there was some good California humor, but the rest of the book was very bland. We opened the book with being like, we are gonna break up the power couple. And of course I'm like, okay, let's see how we're gonna explore this, you know? And we didn't explore it at all. We end the novel with like, maybe we should break up, but maybe we shouldn't. And I felt like I was waiting the entire time for that moment where I go, oh, this is why we wrote a sequel, and it never happened. I feel like we didn't advance the characters at all. And the beginning of Wayward Son and at the end of the novel, Simon and Baz, which are like the two main characters that we're supposed to root for, they're basically in the exact same place emotionally. And we didn't have that many great moments within the book. Not a roast, just facts. I don't know. If it was a movie, I would say I liked it because of the action scenes and like the special effects were cool, but the story just wasn't. I wouldn't watch it again for the story. I would only watch it again to be like, oh wow, the CGI. So I think I gave this a 3 stars because, you know, the scenes were nice and the scenes were well fleshed out. Like I could imagine the scenes as I'm reading them, but in terms of the characters and in terms of the plot and in terms of why did we write this book, there is no reason. And it turns out there's going to be a 3rd book. So I'm like, if we already don't have a reason for the 2nd book, why are we going to have a 3rd book? But we'll see what happens. Further critiquing this book, I don't know if this is like relevant, but I don't love the new cover design. They also redid Carry On's cover design, and I just prefer when the face of the character is not on the book. You had to hold the book and see it every single time you closed it. I think it creates dissonance because you kind of want the reader to be able to imagine what the characters look like. And if your imagination and what's on the cover don't match, it's kind of just like, ew. Not against the artist. The artist did a great job, but just conceptually, I wasn't here for it. Oh, and then a quick side note about the performance of the person reading the book. This person was very confusing in their narration. The core cast is British, and the book is in their perspectives, so it's British most of the time, but then there's also some of the California characters and like the American characters, and I just could not tell what this man's original accent was. Because he would do the British accent, and there'd be moments where I'm like, that's not convincing. But then he'd do the American accent, and I'd also be like, that's not convincing. So I don't know what was going on with him, but I wouldn't say the narration hindered the process, but that was just an interesting note. Like, would I recommend reading it? No. Next is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I think I gave it a 4 stars, so we'll say at the top I gave it a 4 stars, but I read this book twice. I kind of read it twice at the same time, so I would read, and then I would reread, and then I would read, and then I would reread, and that's because I was reading it with my English class. So let's start with the prose, the good parts. So The Handmaid's Tale, I don't know if I should give like a little summary for all of these, but The Handmaid's Tale, it's a dystopia. It's set, I think it's supposed to be set in like a dystopia of the 80s, and it's a super religious society where the fertility rates are low, and so you have these ladies called the handmaids. There's a TV show about this. I don't know if I need to explain it, but there are these handmaid ladies who have to have the children of the upper class people, and so the themes are women's oppression and like sexual slavery and stuff like that. So what did I like about The Handmaid's Tale? The Handmaid's Tale has a great stream of consciousness. This one, I read the actual book and I listened to the audiobook narrated by Elizabeth Moss, which, ooh, I have a note about that. But the book doesn't use a ton of quotation marks. It kind of flows between scenes, and it does a great way of capturing the way that the mind works and handles grief, so I really enjoyed that a lot. I enjoyed the world building a lot. I think that the world was built very clearly. You could understand, okay, what is the setting? What is the purpose of things like the Previganzas and the salvagings, which are terms created by Atwood in her novel? I think it made a ton of sense. I do have to say, if there hadn't been a TV show or like a nice drawing on the front of the cover, the handmaids wear these bonnets, and in the book they're referred to as the white wings. And I think if I hadn't seen a visual representation, I wouldn't be able to understand what she meant by wings. Because, for example, on the book, I think this was the original book design before the TV show, but on the book you can see they have like little wings on top. But in the show, obviously they have the bonnets that go like this, which could be perceived as like wings on the side. So I think that imagery was a little confusing, but other than that, it was good. The ending? This is the part where I was like, what? Because according to our English teacher, it ends after the historical notes. It's all in first person from Offred, the main character. And then at the end, you have this page called Historical Notes. This is one of the only ones I have a physical copy for. So using my physical copy. And usually, you know, this is the kind of stuff I would ignore because I'm like, I don't want to read that. And interestingly enough, in the audiobook, this isn't there. The historical notes are not part of the audiobook. So you think, oh, this isn't part of the book. But according to our English teacher, this is the end. And the historical notes is like, it's kind of hard to explain. It's like a meta book, but it's a talk that's given at a college in 2195 that's reflecting on this piece of historical text they found called The Handmaid's Tale, and like, what did it mean? And so it's kind of like, it's a fake contextualization of the book and saying like, in this historical timeline, what were these different things? What were these experiences? Were they real? Da 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 da. And yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to end the novel. This is a 2017 reprint. As far as I know, the actual text and the historical notes are from the 1984 version, but it's interesting that the audiobook left out the historical notes, which are considered to be the ending. So I think that's a little strange. For The Handmaid's Tale, graphic. Is it graphic? I would say it's not as graphic as the TV series. I think the TV series definitely plays up, you know, the factor. And I think that you can definitely read this book without being scarred for life. And I would recommend reading this book. Unlike Wayward Son, if you haven't read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, I would suggest it. However, Now is my critique of how this book is taught in schools. So my school is one of the most conservative schools in our district, and our school, plus one of the most liberal schools in our district, were the only ones to read The Handmaid's Tale, and we read it as part of our IB curriculum, and it's one of the texts that we can analyze for our IB oral. That being said, I think we completely missed the boat on how this book was taught. And the reason why I'm going to say this, not because my English teacher is watching this, I really hope she's not, but it's because I'm guessing that this book has been taught like this before, so I'm just going to say, like, we shouldn't teach it like this. Okay, so the way that we've read this book is we focused on things like the motif of eyes, the color imagery, and I kid you not, I have 120 pages of notes about this book, because we had to find 7 to 10 salient features per page. It would take me about 30 minutes to read a page this long because I have to annotate every single line and write about all the different motifs and authorial choices. And while I think this is a very, very rich text, and I think it's super well written, and there is a lot to glean from every single line, I think when you focus on all of the authorial choices, you miss the overarching point of the novel, which is to address like religious indoctrination and women's inequalities and suppression. And also Margaret Atwood speaks about how everything in her novel was historically based. In the 2017 foreword, she said that when she wrote this, she wanted to make sure that none of what she wrote about was something she just invented. While she did give it her own names and kind of world build to make everything make sense, everything, all of the like sexual oppression and modes of torture were things that she had read about or seen in real life. So I think when you take a piece of text like this and you focus so much on the talent of the author in their sentence writing and you miss the theme, that is dangerous and not the point of this novel. Like, for example, this is a senior class, so most of the class is 17 or 18, which means technically they are consenting adults, but every single time that we would come across lines that had any kind of sexual innuendo, we would skip it. Which you could say, oh, that's fine. Like, there's an entire chapter that deals with the ceremony, and it's like, oh, we can skip that. Okay, it's fine. But for those of you who have read this book, the main character, Offred, her best friend's name is Moira, and Moira is like a lesbian feminist, and she also has a lot of crude humor. And so we would also cut that out. We wouldn't read that. And I think, just from seeing the questions that my other classmates had while we were reading this, it really took away from their ability to understand what was going on in the novel, and a lot of people just completely missed the boat on what the point was. So I think if you teach this book, if you are a teacher, or if you read this book, you have to pay attention to the overarching theme. You cannot just look at the authorial choices. But that being said, I do recommend The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It's a 4 stars because I think it's a very strong novel. I think it has a great plot. I did not enjoy the way that it was taught to me, and there was another reason that I didn't give it a 5 stars. I think it's because it's a little bit slow moving. Definitely the show, I've seen like the first 5 episodes, I think, of the first season when they first came out. The show is very fast moving, and this is much more of an exploration. Like, if the show is the blockbuster and this is the indie movie, it's very, very slow moving. Like, we were 75% through the novel and she's just still walking around going, I'm going to the grocery store. Man, life in this dystopia sucks. I don't know if I was reading this on my own, if I would keep pushing all the way through. I think it is still pretty captivating, and I think that the stream of consciousness and the flashbacks help keep the plot moving forward, but it is a little bit slow moving, and the action kind of all happens very, very quickly at the end. Next, I read The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Hollenberg. Wohlleben. Peter Wohlleben. This is a, how would I describe it? I would kind of say it's almost like a memoir, a non-fiction memoir, and this is originally, I believe, from reading the book, this is what I believe. I have done zero research to confirm this hypothesis, that this was originally written in German and it was translated to English, because the author several times alludes to being German. He'll like give phrases in German and say, oh, we use this colloquial saying. So that's what makes me think that this book was originally written in German. It's called The Hidden Life of Trees. It's all about trees. The author is a forester. This is a nonfiction, so everything in this is real. The author and the speaker of the novel are the same person. It's about his journey as a forester and everything that he discovered about trees that aren't usually studied. So it's not about photosynthesis, but instead it's about how the trees connect their root systems to support each other, how there's the relationship between the adult trees and the young trees, and how it's parental and almost mirrors human society and animal society, and how the forest works together to stay alive. I gave this a 5 stars. I would definitely suggest reading this. I would say at times it is a little non-fiction focused. I think the only reason that kind of made my brain tired is because I go to school all day, and then I would take a break from school by studying trees. But I think this book, like if you're just reading it in the summer, it wouldn't make your brain tired. I really liked that it was very educational. I learned a lot about European trees, and I think it was written very beautifully. I think there's a good mix between good facts about trees, humor, and gorgeous imagery. This one I also read in an audiobook. The narrator was great. There was a lot of applicability to the relationships of trees, to the relationships of our lives. So I think this book could also be read through like it starts with and I want to say psychology, but that's not correct. Philosophical perspective, because it almost has these proverbs, things that are applicable to our lives. Okay, said in so many words. I really enjoyed Hidden Life of Trees. It's a 5 star. I don't have anything else to say. You should read it. Next, I have 2 more books left. Next, I read A Doll's House by Henrique Ibsen. This was a reread. This is a play that was originally written in Norwegian. It was originally written in Norwegian, and this is the English translation. I read it for my IB oral because that's what I'm doing my IB oral on. I'm doing a comparison of Doll's House and Handmaid's Tale, and it was okay. I just put it on here because I read it. I remember the first time I read it kind of being like, because at the very end, Nora, basically it's a, oh, this is spoiler, it's a marital exploration between a husband and a wife, and long story short, at the very end, the wife asks for a divorce. And this piece was written, I think, in the 1800s, 1800. And I just remember reading it and being like, what? Because everyone's like, yes, Nora, ask for a divorce. And I was like, that just feels so unrealistic. And I know that this piece was commended for being groundbreaking because it featured a strong female lead. But I remember at the time being like, at the time of first reading this, I said, at the time that this play came out, people liked this? Like, there is no way. So yeah, I don't know. I reread it. I was like, oh, okay, this is happening. But I was reminded of an interesting fact for all y'all who have read The Doll's House. Originally, this play was written with 2 endings, and that the play foreshadows that at the end, Nora doesn't actually get a divorce, but she commits suicide, because at the end, she's like, I gotta go to the river. The river is so cold. And throughout the play that she is speaking about that. So I completely forgot that happened. I'd be interested in rereading a 3rd time and looking for those authorial choices of river imagery. But yeah, that's an interesting note. Another note about A Doll's House is I know that there was some guy who wrote A Doll's House 2. And I remember hearing about that at the time and being like, what on earth? And I Googled it, and it's like, what happens after Nora got the divorce? And people love A Doll's House 2. Usually plays do not have sequels. I mean, the only other sequel I can think of is Phantom of the Opera and I can't even remember the title, something or other about love. So I thought that was very, very strange, but obviously it shows that there are some people who like the divorcing ending. This time around reading it, I was just kind of like, blah, this is happening. I don't even know if I gave this any stars, but I would give it a 3 stars. I would say if you're a theater person, it's a good read because Ibsen is considered a classical writer for theater, and in some interpretations is considered the beginning of the contemporary age of theater. So it's a good essential to know, but it's not like, oh, we need to all go out right now and read A Doll's House. The final book that I finished reading was Witches by Roald Dahl. That was the first thing that I learned, was Roald Dahl. R-O-A-L-D. I am 99% sure every single time I was growing up we just said Roald Dahl, but it's Roald Dahl. Roald. This book, the reason why I decided to read it is because obviously we all know about the Dr. Seuss thing that's going on, was that like he wrote some books with some racial undertones and so they all got taken out, and the producers of the books, the printer guys, were like, we are not going to print this anymore. We are not going to let children read this racist material. But I was reading an article about the removal of the books, and it was saying that Dr. Seuss has been criticized for some of his beliefs, and they're saying, and so have several other classical children's book authors. For example, Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Did you know that it features slavery and imperialism? And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah. Obviously the article wasn't speaking to me. This is me speaking to the article. But the article said originally that the Oompa Loompas, it's like, they weren't called Oompa Loompas, and they were just called like black people that we took to work in our chocolate factory. And the producers were like, no, you can't say that. And so he changed it to Oompa Loompas from Loompa Land, but it still has the same themes. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory was the first play that I was ever in, first musical that I was ever in, so we go way back. But I just can't believe that it never once crossed my mind that the Oompa Loompas were slaves. And that, like, you know, chocolate was one of the big products in slavery. Yeah. So that was an interesting discovery that I made reading this article. And I was kind of like, well, duh, like, obviously, it's just so clearly there. Like, it says we don't pay them. Anyways, it was saying Roald Dahl's book, The Witches, has also been criticized for being anti-Semitic. And I was like, what? Again, I was like, what? I don't remember that, but also I probably didn't know what that was at the time I was reading this book. The only memory that I have of Witches is there's a scene, this is like my memory, was that there's this big scene where one of the witches slices the bottom of a mattress and she puts all these bottles up there that I would like describe now as drugs. She hides all her drugs in the mattress, and I remember just being so shocked and being like, I can't believe that people do this. And like, oh my gosh, this terrible lady, like, they're hiding the drugs in the mattress. That was my only memory of this book. So I was like, I wanted an easy read, and this book is only 4 or 5 hours, I think, on audio. So I was like, you know what, I'll read it and I'll put on my literary ears and see if I hear anything. That being said, someone blow the foghorn because I completely missed any warning signs whatsoever. So when I filmed this video, I decided to just go forward with my thoughts and do absolutely zero research, which I don't know why she decided to do that. But in the editing process, I thought I would look up because I didn't see any big signs like, oh my gosh, you know, and that is my own ignorance, girl. So let's just do a quick breakdown of the anti-Semitism in Witches by Roald Dahl. My resource is this website called Hey Alma with the article title, Is Roald Dahl's Witches Anti-Semitic? So the first one that would be obvious to most people is their noses. They're like, they have these giant noses and they have big nose holes, which is a Jewish stereotype. And then second, which was one I didn't know, was the wigs. The witches all wear wigs because they're bald, but that comes from the Jewish tradition of covering the hair. So there's that. There's also the money. This is one of those ridiculous moments where you go, oh, the signs are so clearly there, and completely missed it. So the next one is money, which is, there's an idea that Jewish people control the world with all their money, and the Grand High Witch, she prints money, and they have this whole plan of how they're gonna rule the world. And the last one was that they kill children because they hate children, but that could be related to this conspiracy theory that Jewish people like to kill Christian children and take their blood. So there is definitely a lot of stereotyping going on in there. This article also included some terrible quotes from Roald Dahl, which confirm that this wasn't just an authorial choice like, whoa, let's make scary noses. It was like he was so clearly anti-Semitic, and it came out in his writing as a piece of propaganda. That being said, obviously I'm not one to judge and say like, oh, you know, kids don't know, so they wouldn't pick up on it. I definitely think that's true. I think you would have to have a well-versed knowledge of the stereotype to pick it up, because like, I don't have a great schema of the stereotype, and I couldn't pick it up as an adult. However, I don't think that's a good reason to say like, yay, we should allow this book, it's totally fine. I don't really know whether I think that this book is fine or not. Obviously, it's offensive, but there's definitely the interesting argument of like, when the offensiveness slightly flies under the radar for people who wouldn't know, what do we do? But yeah, I just thought I would include that I completely missed the boat, and I do not do any commentary on the bad undertones of this book. I'm going to continue to let myself speak about the other authorial choices and audio performance things that I saw, but I wanted to say up top that, yes, there is some anti-Semitic undertones in this book. I mean, not undertones, like blatantly obvious. And if you also, like me, read this book and completely missed it, you should do some research and understand what you don't understand. So it's about a little boy and his grandma, and I really appreciated the beginning, because the beginning, the book kind of has three sections. The beginning, obviously, the middle, and the end. But the beginning is mostly just a conversation between the grandma and the grandson, and I thought that was kind of interesting in a children's book, because it's so simple. It's just, they're just sitting and having a conversation. I think that was at least the first hour of the book. So that kind of struck me as an interesting authorial choice, because usually children's books have a lot of action and a lot of stuff going on. And while their dialogue was engaging, I just thought it was an interesting authorial choice. And then the middle, they meet some witches, they kill the witches, they overcome them. And that kind of feels like where the book should end. But then there's a whole nother 45 minutes after they kill the witches where they make this plan of how they're going to kill all the witches. Obviously, we could say, like, that's problematic. And at the beginning of the book, I was kind of like, is this problematic against women? Because they're like, oh, these women, they dress nicely, they act nicely, they're nice to children, but we need to kill them. No, women. But there is a line where they're like, oh, they're not women, they're witches, they're devils who wear the skins of women. So I was like, okay, I guess like there we can say, I guess this book isn't anti-women. But I thought it was interesting that the ending was so long. Like, there's a line where the boy, the main character, he gets turned into a mouse. And so at the end, they're talking about like, oh, now that I'm a mouse, I won't live as long as I would if I was a boy. And then he's like, but it made me realize, like, you don't need to live for a long time. You just need to have people who love you. And I was like, oh, like, this is the end. Like, that was a sweet lesson in a book that's about killing witches. But then it just kept going. And it just kept going like, okay, so we're going to go to the castle, and we're going to kill the witches, and we're going to get all of them, and they're going to, like, get eaten by cats. And it was just a lot. So that's, like, the exposition of the book. I thought it was fine. I mean, it's a children's book. We have to read it for what it is. I do have to say that this audiobook, this is about the audio performance, I did not know that it had sound effects. I did not know that when I borrowed this from the library. And I was reading it, and the grandma, she's missing a thumb, and so they're like, Grandma, did your thumb get pulled off? And then in the background, there's just a sound that's like, and like the sound of a thumb being pulled off, and I was like, and it turned out the whole time they had sound effects. And after that, I did enjoy the sound effects. I think it really filled out the audio experience of this book. And I am an audiobook lover, so I really enjoyed it. I would say sometimes the narrator's accents for the different characters got a little out of control, and they were really in character, and they would have translated if it was a movie or a TV show, because we'd have visual pairing to understand what was going on when we couldn't understand what the person speaking was saying. But there were a couple times where I was like, and I would be interested to see if the text has, there's probably a term for this, but if they had written out what the accent was, or if the accent was an interpretation of the narrator. But it turns out that scene that I remember about the bottles, it was like one line long. It was just like, oh, the mouse was running and he saw that the mattress had a slit and there were all the bottles. In my mind, that was like the whole book. So that's all the books that I read for the months of January, February, and the first half of March. So, where are we headed next? So my TBR to be read for the month of March, I am currently in progress of reading Le Petit Prince with my French class. I cried already. It's really good. I've been enjoying it a lot. That's a children's book that I'm like, everyone should read this. But we unfortunately had to put it on hold so we could get ready for our IB orals. So that one will probably take me a while to finish. I'm also in progress of reading a man called, I want to say it's Ove. The narrator of the book thinks that it's Uve. I really don't know. I'm sorry to this man, because this book was recommended to me by my friend Melissa Brado, the co-host of Letter by Letter podcast, and she's like a little literary queen, so I was like, you know, I will take her suggestion. I'm sure it's great. And she's like, you will cry, it'll be so good. And I was like, okay. So I started reading it. I'm probably got like 3 hours in. I think I made it to like 25%. This one was also an audiobook, but the beginning is super boring. I'm sorry to this man again, roasting. The beginning is super boring, super slow. And then it's like, it follows an old man, obviously an old man named Ove, and then a young family moves in next door, and this man is like seriously depressed because his wife died, and you're like, oh, okay, like obviously this is going to be a story about how the young whippersnapper family like makes him love life again, and he can go on this great journey. And I just felt like I saw the entire exposition of the novel, and I was like, okay, like I'm not living for the world building, and I'm not living for the characters we've met yet, and I already feel like I know where it's going. Like, why am I still reading this? And then, this was the kicker, was that the family that moves in next to the guy named Uve, the man called Uve, it's a white man, like a white young man, and an immigrant wife is how she's described. And from her descriptions, I don't know why, but I just imagined her as Japanese. Later, like halfway through the book, they say like, she's Middle Eastern. I forget exactly what. I think she might have been Iranian. I'm not entirely sure. But I was like, why did we wait this long if it's such an essential character choice? But the reader reads her with an accent. It's not great. It's really not great. And I'm like, why are we doing this? And the other thing too is that there are kids. There are two little kids in the story, and the reader also reads them with accents. I just thought it was really interesting that they allowed this man to speak like this. And also, this was my note, was that you see this often, and it doesn't really matter with what ethnicity, but usually when you have an immigrant parent and children that grow up in the United States, the children have American accents. I mean, I could say, look at me. My mother grew up in the Philippines. She is an immigrant. She has a slight Filipino accent, no roast, mom. And I have an American accent. So why did he give the children this weird accent that he made up? So yeah, the book returned itself to the library because it took me so long to read, but I re-requested it and I'm 5th in line, so it will take a long time for it to come back, but I'll finish it since I already started it. We'll see if it gets any better. Finally, I think that's 2 books. My 3rd book that's on my TBR is In Praise of Shadows. This book, I heard an excerpt from this book and I was like, oh my gosh, the authorial choices, the diction, the syntax. I was like, I need to read this. It is originally written in Japanese, translated to English, and it is an essay about things. many different things. I think it's a small collection of essays. My local library did not have this, neither did the sassy people at our local bookstore. Literally, we have a used bookstore in our town, and I love going there, and every time I go there to buy a book, I'm like, yes, I'm supporting small business, I'm supporting secondhand, and every single time I ask the workers a question, they sass me and they're rude to me. Anyways, so I ordered the In Praise of Shadows, and it is arriving soon, and I'm very excited to read it. So that one I will probably finish. It's pretty short. Thank you so much for joining me to critique the 5 books that I read in 2 months. I'm killing my goal so far. Thank you for letting me share with you what's on my TBR and what I'm excited to read. Hashtag she's a reader. If you have read any of these books and you have things to say, feel free to comment them down below. If you have any suggestions for me, also comment those. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. Give it a like. But I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, see you later. Keep reading. Speedy Reader.